Hi guys and welcome back. My name is Alexandra and in this video we're going to explore membrane structure and function based on Chapter 7 of Campbell Biology. So cell membranes might look simple at first glance, but they're actually one of the most important dynamic structures in all of biology. They control what enters and leaves a cell, help cells communicate, and make life inside the cell possible. We'll break down how membranes are built, how they stay flexible, and how they manage all the traffic going in and out of the cell. So let's dive in and discover how the cell membrane works as the cell's gatekeeper, communicator, and life support system, all in one. So first, why do cells need membranes? So imagine trying to live in a house with no walls, no doors, and no windows. Everything could rush in or out and things would get chaotic pretty quickly. Cells face the same challenge. That's why every cell is surrounded by a membrane. The cell membrane acts like a protective boundary separating the inside of the cell from the outside world. But it's much more than just a wall. It's carefully controlled. It carefully controls what enters and leaves the cell. And for example, nutrients, water, and oxygen all need to come in and wastes need to leave. So this is what the cell regulates. This membrane also allows cells to communicate with one another and respond to changes in the environment. And most importantly, membranes help maintain homeostasis, which means keeping internal conditions stable. So without cell membranes, life as we know is simply not possible. You can think of the cell membrane as the cell's security system, checking IDs and deciding who gets in and who has to leave. Every cell, whether it's a tiny bacterium or one of the trillions of cells in your body, is surrounded by a structure called the plasma membrane, also known as the cell membrane. The plasma membrane is a thin and flexible boundary that separates the inside of the cell from the outside environment. Even though it's incredibly thin, only about 7 to 10 nanometers thick, it does an amazing job protecting the cell and controlling what moves in and out. This membrane is made mostly of phospholipids and proteins. The phospholipids form the basic structure of the membrane, while proteins perform important jobs like transporting materials and sending signals. What's really impressive is just how thin the membrane is. At only 7 to 10 nanometers thick, you need a stack of about 10,000 cell membranes to equal the thickness of a sheet of paper. That's pretty thin. If cell membranes entered a pancake contest, they'd definitely win the award for thinnest stack. Another important point is that all cells have a plasma membrane. This includes both prokaryotic cells like bacteria and eukaryotic cells like plant cells and animal cells. No matter how simple or complex a cell is, every cell needs a membrane to survive. Okay, to understand how cell membranes work, we first need to meet their main building blocks, phospholipids. In this picture here, you can see that the head is this red sphere here, and these two squiggly lines are the tails, the green tails. And then, so each phospholipid molecule has two really different parts. The first part is a hydrophobic head. That's the red sphere here. Hydrophobic means water-loving, so this head is attracted to water. Attached to the head are two hydrophobic tails. Hydrophobic means water-fearing, so these tails try to avoid water whenever possible. You could say these tails dislike water so much that if they saw a swimming pool, they'd probably turn around and walk the other way. Because phospholipids have both the water-loving region and a water-fearing region, they're called amphipathic molecules. The prefix amphi means both because these molecules contain both hydrophilic and hydrophobic regions. This unique structure causes phospholipids to self-assemble in water. Their heads naturally face the watery environments inside and outside the cell, while the tails hide away from water by pointing inward. It's almost as if the phospholipids are organizing themselves into the perfect group photo. The heads smile for the camera on the outside, while the tails hide in the middle where no water can bother them. This simple behavior allows cell membranes to form automatically, one of biology's coolest examples of molecules organizing themselves. Scientists once thought that the cell membrane was a rigid structure, kind of like a brick wall, but in 1972, scientists Singer and Nicholson proposed a very different idea called the fluid mosaic model. According to this model, membranes are fluid, which means their molecules are constantly moving sideways within the membrane. The membrane isn't stiff or frozen, it's more like a thin layer of oil. Embedded within this phospholipid bilayer are many different proteins that can drift and move around. You can think of these proteins as tiny boats floating in a sea of phospholipids. The membrane is called a mosaic because it contains many different types of molecules: proteins, phospholipids, cholesterol, and carbohydrates, all arranged in a patchwork pattern, much like the colorful pieces in a mosaic artwork. This membrane fluidity is extremely important because cells need flexible membranes to grow, divide, transport materials, communicate with other cells, and respond to changes in their environment. If the membrane were completely rigid, the cell would have a really hard time functioning. It would be kind of like trying to dance while wearing a suit made entirely of brick, and it's not very effective and probably not a great look either. Although phospholipids form the basic structure of the membrane, proteins are the molecules that do much of the membrane's work. There's two main types of membrane proteins. Integral proteins are embedded within the membrane itself. Some even stretch all the way across the membrane from one side to the other. In contrast, peripheral proteins are attached only to the membrane surface, either on the inside or outside of the cell. Membrane proteins perform many different functions. Some act as transport proteins, helping substances move across the membrane. This is really important because many molecules can't pass through the phospholipid bilayer on their own. Other proteins function as enzymes, which can speed up chemical reactions, or as receptors, which can receive signals from outside the cell. Still, other proteins help cells communicate with one another, allowing cells to coordinate their activities and respond to their environment. You can think of membrane proteins as the cell membrane's employees. Some are security guards checking who gets in, some are messengers delivering information, and some are maintenance workers keeping everything running smoothly. The membrane would be pretty understaffed without them. Membrane proteins are incredibly versatile. In fact, they perform so many different jobs that the cell would have a hard time surviving without them. One major function of membrane proteins is to transport molecules across membranes. Some proteins act as channels or carriers, helping substances move into or out of the cell when they can't pass through the phospholipid bilayer on their own. Other membrane proteins serve as receptors. These proteins receive chemical signals such as hormones or neurotransmitters from outside the cell and relay that information to the inside. It's a bit like answering a phone call. The receptor picks up the message and tells the cell how to respond. Some membrane proteins function as enzymes, speeding up important chemical reactions right at the membrane surface. Membrane proteins can also join neighboring cells together, helping form tissues and keeping cells organized. Without these connections, many tissues in your body wouldn't stay intact. Finally, certain membrane proteins help anchor the cytoskeleton inside the cell and attach it to the extracellular matrix outside the cell. This protects the cell and then maintains the shape because So the cytoskeleton kind of is like the support structure for the cell, and then without the cytoskeleton, the cell would be like a sagging lump of like fluid and the membrane. Anyway, you can think of the membrane proteins as the staff members of a busy school. Some are security guards controlling who enters, some are teachers passing along information, some are maintenance workers keeping things running, and some make sure everyone stays connected and organized. The cell definitely couldn't run on a snow day without them. Although carbohydrates make up only a small part of the cell membrane, they play some very important roles. In the membrane, carbohydrates are usually attached to either proteins or lipids. When a carbohydrate is attached to a protein, the structure is called a glycoprotein. When a carbohydrate is attached to a lipid, it's called a glycolipid. These carbohydrate-containing molecules stick out from the outer surface of the cell membrane, um, almost like tiny antennae or name tags. One of their most important functions is cell recognition. Cells use these carbohydrate tags to identify one another. For example, your body's cells can recognize neighboring cells as part of the same organism. This recognition is especially important in the immune system. Immune cells constantly check these molecular ID tags to determine whether a cell belongs in the body or might be an invading pathogen. You can think of membrane carbohydrates as the cell's ID badges. Immune cells are like security guards checking everyone's badges to make sure only authorized cells are allowed in. And just like in real life, if someone shows up with a suspicious looking ID, the immune system may ask a few very serious questions. One of the most important properties of cell membranes is fluidity. Remember, membranes are not rigid structures, they're constantly moving. The types of fatty acids and phospholipids play a major role in determining how fluid a membrane is. Unsaturated fatty acids contain one or more double bonds that create bends or kinks in their tails. These kinks prevent the phospholipids from packing tightly together, which increases membrane fluidity. On the other hand, saturated fatty acids have straight tails with no double bonds. Because these tails are straight, they pack closely together, making the membrane less fluid. Temperature also affects membrane movement. When the temperature decreases, phospholipids move more slowly and the membrane can get too rigid. When temperatures increase, the membrane gets too fluid. To solve this problem, cells can adjust the composition of their membranes. For example, cells living in colder environments often increase the number of unsaturated fatty acids to help keep their membranes flexible. You can think of unsaturated fatty acids as people carrying giant backpacks in a crowded hallway. They keep bumping into each other and can't pack tightly together. Saturated fatty acids, on the other hand, line up so neatly that they'd probably win an award for most organized molecules. Next, animal cell membranes contain another important component besides phospholipids and proteins, cholesterol. Cholesterol molecules are tucked in between the phospholipids of the membrane where they help regulate membrane fluidity. At cold temperatures, phospholipids tend to pack tightly together, making the membrane too rigid. Cholesterol prevents this by disrupting the tight packing of phospholipids, helping the membrane stay flexible. At warm temperatures, membranes can become too fluid, almost like they're starting to melt. In this case, cholesterol helps restrain phospholipid movement, preventing the membrane from becoming excessively fluid. Because cholesterol helps maintain the proper balance between rigidity and fluidity, it's also called a fluidity buffer. You can think of cholesterol as the membrane's thermostat. When things get too cold, it keeps the membrane from becoming stiff. When things get too warm, it keeps everything from getting too chaotic. In other words, cholesterol is like that one friend who always says, "Everyone relax, we're not freezing and we're not melting either." One of the most important properties of the cell membrane is selective permeability. Selective permeability means that the membrane allows some substances to pass through more easily than others. In other words, the membrane is picky about what gets in and what gets out. Small nonpolar molecules such as oxygen and carbon dioxide can move directly through the phospholipid bilayer with little difficulty. These molecules are small enough and interact well enough with the membrane's interior to pass through easily. However, large molecules or charged molecules such as ions and sugars cannot um, usually can't cross the membrane on their own. Instead, they often need help from specialized transport proteins. This selectivity is really important because it helps cells maintain homeostasis, keeping the cell's internal environment stable even when conditions outside the cell change. For example, oxygen or O2 can easily enter the cell so it can be used in cellular respiration, while CO2 or carbon dioxide can easily leave as a waste product. You can think of the cell membrane as a very selective club. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are on the VIP list and walk right in, while larger or charged molecules often have to wait for an escort to let them through. Now let's talk about passive transport, one of the main ways substances move across cell membranes. Passive transport requires no cellular energy. The cell doesn't have to spend any ATP to make it happen. Instead, substances move down their concentration gradient, which means they move from an area where they are more concentrated to an area where they are less concentrated. A good way to think about this is perfume in a room. If someone sprays perfume in one corner, the scent molecules eventually spread throughout the room all by themselves. Nobody has to push them. They naturally move from high concentration to low concentration. There's three main types of passive transport: diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. As molecules continue to move, they eventually reach equilibrium, a state where the concentration is roughly the same on both sides. The molecules are still moving, but there's no overall net movement in one direction. You can think of passive transport like kids leaving a crowded cafeteria. At first, everyone moves from the packed area to the emptier hallways, and eventually people become spread out more evenly. No teacher has to push them. They just naturally spread out on their own. One of the simplest forms of passive transport is diffusion. Diffusion is the net movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, as we said before. In other words, molecules naturally spread out over time. This process occurs because molecules are in constant random motion. Even though individual molecules move in all directions, the overall or net movement is from areas where molecules are crowded to areas where they are less crowded. Importantly, diffusion requires no ATP or cellular energy. The molecules move spontaneously because of their own random motion. Diffusion plays an essential role in living cells. For example, oxygen molecules diffuse into cells so they can be used for cellular respiration, while carbon dioxide diffuses out of cells as a waste product. A classic example is spraying air freshener in one corner of the room, kind of like the perfume example. So at first, people nearby can smell it, but not people far away. But eventually, the scent spreads throughout the entire room as the molecules diffuse. You can think of diffusion like students leaving a packed classroom after the bell rings. At first, everyone is crowded together, but soon students naturally spread out into the hallway. No teacher has to organize them, although sometimes that might help. Osmosis is a special type of diffusion that involves only one molecule, water. Specifically, osmosis is a diffusion of water across a selectively permeable membrane, such as a cell membrane. During osmosis, water moves from an area of lower solute concentration where there is more free water to an area of higher solute concentration where there is less free water. You can think of water as moving towards the side with more dissolved substances. Depending on the surrounding solution, cells can respond in different ways. If a cell is placed in a hypertonic solution, which has a higher solute concentration outside the cell, water leaves the cell and the cell shrinks. If the cell is placed in a hypotonic solution, which has a lower solute concentration outside the cell, water enters the cell and the cell swells. In an isotonic solution, the solute concentrations are equal inside and outside the cell, so there's no net movement of water and the cell remains about the same size. You can think of water molecules as always trying to balance things out. They're a bit like students choosing lunch lines. Everyone keeps moving towards the line with fewer people until the cafeteria becomes more evenly distributed. Some molecules are simply too large or too charged to pass directly through the phospholipid bilayer. That's where facilitated diffusion comes in. Facilitated diffusion is a type of passive transport that uses transport proteins to help substances cross the membrane. Even though proteins are involved, no ATP or cellular energy is required because molecules are still moving down their concentration gradient from high concentration to low concentration. There's two main types of transport proteins involved. First, channel proteins form tiny passageways or tunnels through the membrane. Specific molecules or ions can move through these channels almost like cars traveling through a tunnel. Second, carrier proteins bind to a specific molecule and then change shape, allowing that molecule to move across the membrane. Facilitated diffusion is especially important for transporting substances like glucose and a lot of ions, which can't easily cross the membrane on their own. You can think of transport proteins as the membrane's transportation system. Channel proteins are like tunnels that go through a mountain, while carrier proteins are more like revolving doors that let only certain molecules through. No ticket required, but you do need to be on the guest list. Not all movement across the cell membrane is passive. Some substances need to be moved against their concentration gradient from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. This is called active transport. Because this goes against the natural direction of movement, the cell must use energy, usually in the form of ATP. Active transport relies on specialized membrane proteins called protein pumps. These pumps change shape to move molecules across the membrane, almost like a revolving door that only works when powered. A classic example of active transport is a sodium-potassium pump, which moves sodium ions out of the cell and potassium ions into the cell. This process is essential for maintaining proper ion balance, which is critical for nerve signaling and many other functions. Active transport helps the cell maintain conditions that are really different from its surroundings. Without it, cells would quickly lose their internal balance. You can think of active transport like pushing people up an escalator that's going downward. It takes effort, energy, and a very determined machine to make it happen. And in this case, the machine is powered by ATP. Some molecules are simply too large to pass through the cell membrane using diffusion or protein channels. For these, cells use a process called bulk transport. Bulk transport moves large materials in or out of the cell using membrane-bound sacs called vesicles. When a cell needs to release materials, it uses a process called exocytosis. In exocytosis, vesicles inside the cell fuse with the plasma membrane and release their contents outside the cell. This is how cells can export things like proteins or signaling molecules. When a cell needs to bring materials in it uses endocytosis. In this process, the cell membrane folds inward to engulf substances and form a vesicle inside the cell. One special type of endocytosis is phagocytosis, also called cell eating. This is where the cell engulfs large particles or even other cells. Immune cells often use this strategy to destroy bacteria and other pathogens. Bulk transport is especially important in nerve cells, which release neurotransmitters, and in immune cells, which need to engulf and remove harmful invaders. In this picture here, you can see that. Why is my laser not working? Okay, so you see these blue particles. So basically, the cell membrane folds like the two sides here and here. They fold in, engulfing some of the blue particles inside, and then it goes out. And then in this green picture, it's engulfing the green particles and it's going in, and in the blue picture, it's releasing stuff outside. So this is exocytosis and this is endocytosis. So finally, we have some review questions, and feel free to stop the video and answer them. Okay, check your answers and then we'll move on. Let's do one final recap before we wrap up. Today we learned that the plasma membrane is a thin, flexible barrier made mainly of phospholipids and proteins. We explored how phospholipids naturally form a bilayer, how the fluid mosaic model explains the membrane's flexibility, and how proteins and carbohydrates help cells transport molecules, communicate, and recognize one another. We also cover the different ways materials move across the membrane, including passive transport, active transport, and bulk transport, all working together to help cells maintain homeostasis. Hopefully, cell membranes seem a little less mysterious now. And remember, without them, your cells would basically be tiny water balloons with no way to control who comes in or goes out. Not exactly a recipe for survival. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future biology videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Until then, stay curious, keep learning, and remember, your cell membranes are working hard for you 24/7, so give them a little appreciation.